Okay. The first question that's been relayed to me is there a difference between the anti-Semitisms of Britain and the Commonwealth and the former Commonwealth? Let me answer that question in a moment. Let me first respond to David Katz. Let me say first of all that David Katz's book was one of the key books for me in getting to grips with Anglo-Jewish history. But I don't think actually his focus would be on, his understanding of it would be on Anglo-Jewish history, but rather would be on British history insofar as it has a bearing on Jews and insofar as the Jews had a bearing on British history. But it's an important book. We've not met before. I'm sorry that we haven't been able to meet now other than virtually, but I want to thank Professor Katz for his work and to say hello to him. To my mind, he raises two questions that I want to address, and then I'll answer the first question that's been put to me. The two issues that Professor Katz addresses is what we might call the responsibility of the Jews for anti-Semitism. He addresses it by his discussion of the part played by Disraeli in the promoting of a specifically racist anti-Semitism. And the second question he raises is, truly, is it the case that anti-Zionism or hostility to Israel is to be characterized simply as anti-Semitism? So far as the first question is concerned, I think I make 2 points. The first point is it is an interesting question, the extent to which Jews have contributed to the formulation of anti-Semitic positions. If one looks at the development, the emergence of the blood libel in the 12th century, it was first written up, the allegation was first written up in the manuscript of a cleric called Thomas of Monmouth. He arrived in Norwich a few years after the death of the child, William, rumoured to have been done to death by the Jews, and he wrote a book, a manuscript called The Life and Miracles and Death of William of Norwich, and he undertook an investigation, a closer investigation into the circumstances of the child's death. It was a kind of literary detective, and his book is a contributor to the proto-genre of the English detective novel. He concludes, or he concluded during the course of his investigations, that it was likely that the Jews were responsible. But he was unable to satisfy himself with the acceptable degree of certainty until, he says, he met a converted Jew, one Theobald of Cambridge, and Theobald told him, confided in him, that indeed the Jews of Europe meet in Narbonne, which was then a well-known center of Talmudic Jewish communal activity and enterprise, every year in order to draw lots to determine which local community in Europe shall have the honor of reenacting the crucifixion on the body of a Gentile, a Christian child. And Thomas of Monmouth says in his manuscript that this Jewish confession, this confirmation of his own intuition by a Jew or a former Jew, is what, so to speak, tipped him from suspecting the truth to knowing the truth. Now, historians who have investigated this have been unable to identify any Theobald of Cambridge beyond his appearance in the manuscript, and it would be good to think that Theobald was just an invention of Thomas. But it may well not be the case, and certainly if one looks at the history of Jewish participation in anti-Zionism, it's clear that unwillingly, unconsciously or otherwise, there have always been Jews who have contributed to the anti-Semitic cause. It would be nice to think that Jews were the originators in each instance of each iteration of anti-Semitism, because then, so to speak, we could do something about it. I think the emphasis on Disraeli, which in my understanding is a slight overemphasis on Disraeli's role in promoting racist anti-Semitism, may stem from precisely that motivation. And this leads me to the second of the 2 points I want to make in response to this first observation of Professor Katz's. Disraeli's racism, his Jewish racial triumphalism, which actually he somewhat withdrew in his last book, was a response to a condescension which, of course, he found intolerable. It had its roots in a very specific Jewish or post-Jewish response to anti-Semitism. I don't think that although he was much exploited and his character Sidonia was treated, so to speak, as a real Jew confessing true Jewish perfidy, I don't myself think that Disraeli had quite the contribution to the formulation of racist anti-Semitism that Professor Katz suggests. It's an area for perhaps fruitful or fruitless controversy between us. As for the second point, the question of the anti-Semitic character of anti-Zionism, let me say this. I draw a distinction between anti-Zionism and the anti-Semitism, say, of the late 19th, early 20th century. And the distinction I draw is between, on the one hand, in the case of that late 19th, early 20th century anti-Semitism, a Jew hatred which was entirely irrational, which was rooted in nothing more than fantasy, and in relation to anti-Zionism, a hostility to a Jewish project which is potentially, at any rate, rational, but which has become polluted by anti-Semitic tropes. When people in France at the time of Dreyfus ranted about an international Jewish conspiracy, about disloyal Jews working towards the destruction of France, when they made common cause with anti-Semitic leftists who talked about Jewish capitalism, they were talking malevolent nonsense. There was no rational kernel. There was no rational aspect of their attacks. Zionism, on the other hand, unlike capitalism, say, is a genuine Jewish project. It is a project of the Jewish people. It is a collective political endeavor. And of course, as with all endeavors, it's going to attract a good of political opposition. We know that it did. We know, indeed, that Herzl expressly anticipated the opposition of elements to Zionism in the Jewish state. He asked himself the question, will the establishment of a Jewish state, he asked, lead to the disappearance of enemies of the Jews? And he wrote in response to that question, which he posed, absolutely not. The Jewish state will have enemies just like every other state. I think this faith on the part of some Jews to recognize, if you like, the rational enmity towards Zionism, which no doubt existed and continues to exist, is a misunderstanding of the character of one of our own political projects, and it leads to a misdiagnosis of the ways of addressing it. However, it is also the case that much opposition to Israel and the Zionist project is now polluted by anti-Semitic language. And the talk that one encounters in England and elsewhere in the world of, for example, a Jewish lobby, an Israel lobby, rehearses in not terribly mysterious ways precisely that talk of international Jewish conspiracy which was at the center of earlier versions of anti-Semitism, just as, for example, the talk of the genocidal, crucifying activities of the IDF rehearses that blood libel talk, which again was characteristic of earlier versions of anti-Semitism. Now, what therefore we call for, those of us, I think, who try to reflect in a sane and proportionate way on contemporary anti-Zionism, what we call for is not for the elimination of anti-Zionism as a discourse, because there's no doubt it's entirely reasonable and possible for people to take anti-Zionist positions for whatever reason, but rather the purging of contemporary anti-Zionism of anti-Semitic language and tropes. That, I think, is the case that I would make against the anti-Semitic quality of contemporary anti-Zionism, rather than making a case that, so to speak, overstates the objections to it. Now, let me now turn to that first question. The answer is I don't know. The answer is I don't know to what extent anti-Semitism exists in stronger or weaker versions in the Commonwealth, in the former Commonwealth. It's been hard enough to get a sense of the changing and complex character of English anti-Semitism without even going beyond the borders of England into Scotland or Wales or Ireland. In truth, I don't know. Rather than flannel, I would rather confess to ignorance. This is a speech given by a woman called Jenny Tong, and she suggested that Israelis were trading, as I recall the suggestion, that Israelis were trading in human organs arising out of the Haiti disaster. It was an extraordinarily despicable remark to make, and it did actually receive a great deal of opposition. Oh, I'm so sorry. I'm being asked to repeat the question. The question was, why was a member of the House of Lords, a former Liberal Democrat MP, allowed to allege that Israelis were trading in Haitian body parts? Answer, she made the remarks and they were reported. They immediately attracted a great deal of censure. She is a woman with a track record of recycling anti-Semitic language and images in the context of pro-Palestinian speeches, and she is a well-known quantity in English political life. Okay, I'm being asked a question which invites me, I think, to comment or even adjudicate on the respective demerit of state-paid rabbis who give rulings which seek to discriminate against non-Jews, and academics at Israeli universities who make pro-boycott speeches or take positions that are contrary to the interests as they're understood of Israeli universities. I don't think, I mean, these are incommensurable activities, and I don't think it's useful really to relate the one to the other. Of course, one deplores both. I'm very struck, perhaps I could say this, I was very struck by listening to the introductory remarks of both the rector and of Dina to my own speech, because it seems to me that what the Rabbonim are saying has really nothing to do with anti-Semitism. It was interesting to me that in an Israeli context, it was considered necessary to make those. Of course, I understand the topical character of the remarks, but nevertheless, it was considered necessary to make these statements. I sense, and I sense that as well in Professor Katz's remarks, I sense the discomfort amongst Israelis and speaking to an Israeli audience, I sense a discomfort at any suggestion that we Jews should be considered as anything other than autonomous agents in control of our own destiny. The discourse of Jew as victim, which is how anti-Semitism and the history of anti-Semitism is understood, is of course a deeply uncomfortable one for Israelis. Let me say it's a deeply uncomfortable one for Jews elsewhere too, but I sense in the way in which this particular question has been formulated, and as I say in the introductory remarks, a kind of a very specific Israeli perspective, which I find challenging and slightly mystifying. I'm asked whether, added to the cultural reflex in Britain of support for the underdog, in determining a certain bias towards the Palestinians, I'm asked whether one shouldn't also take into account jealousy. Not quite sure. I'm not quite sure from the question the object of the jealousy. It is certainly the case that political public discourse in England, as probably elsewhere in the world, is now, so to speak, largely amnesiac, largely ahistorical. There is no real understanding of the history of disputes. One only experiences, so to speak, the contemporary, contextless, ahistorical reality of them as they're relayed by the media, and in particular by the visual media. That reality, of course, pits a regional power, Israel, against a non-state entity, the Palestinian people, and cannot help but promote a conception of the dispute between the two sides as a deeply unequal one. That seems to me to be a much larger determinant in the understanding of that dispute now than any sentiment of jealousy. All right? I know, I want to thank you. Thank you very much. Okay. No, good to see you. Bye.